The Islamic Council of Victoria recently reported a marked increase in Islamophobia, including verbal abuse or mockery and workplace discrimination. To make matters worse, the ICV estimated that more than 85% of Islamophobic incidents were not reported. So we're seeing just the tip of a very big iceberg. Despite that, the Albanese government has demonstrated something of a double standard. It responded with lightning speed to reports of an increase in incidents of anti-Semitism, even though a sober analysis of those reports show that many incidents were not anti-Semitic at all, but were statements or actions in solidarity with Palestine. It swiftly appointed Gillian Siegel, a conservative and deeply committed Zionist, as anti-Semitism envoy. Siegel released a plan to much media fanfare, which is anchored in support for the IHRA definition, which infamously specifies that criticism of the right of Israel to exist is anti-Semitic. And her report is much more about silencing dissent against Israel than protecting Jewish Australians from hate. But the Albanese government took months longer to appoint Aftab Malik as Australia's special envoy to combat Islamophobia, to a much quieter fanfare. When he released his plan, it seemed to sink without trace, but not before it attracted some serious criticisms, including from my guest today. I'm joined by Dr. Sara Cheikh-Husain. Sara is a researcher and writer based at Deakin University in Victoria, specialising in Islamophobia, social justice and human rights, with a focus on Palestinians, Muslim communities in the West and refugees. Her book, The Politics of Anti-Islamophobia in Australia, The Case of the Muslim Community Organisations, comes out at the end of this year, and I'll put a link to the publisher's website in the show notes. You're listening to The Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity. We're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia, and if you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glanz, and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Naarm or Melbourne. So, welcome, Sara.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the opportunity.
Islamophobia is hurtful and dangerous. How do you define it, and how has it affected your life and the lives of people you care about?
David, I'm a migrant. I came to Australia in 2014. So in the white Australia logic, I'm a very recent migrant. In 2014, if you remember, ISIS was beheading people on TV. And so I came into a land that perceived me as an extension of that barbaric form of Islamism. And so I was greeted with that expectation that I either belong to this group or a victim of that group, given my gender as a woman, and how Islamophobia often and always victimizes women as victims of Islam and angry brown bearded Muslim men. So this is the context within which I emerged as a migrant, and it was confronting, especially that I'm educated, privileged, considered middle class, Syrian / born and raised in the UAE migrant. So I was confronted with that. I did not know what was happening. I couldn't label what I was feeling, perceiving, experiencing as a Muslim hijabi Muslim woman, as well as a mother of 4 kids who have been denied access to birthday parties, being treated really badly at school. So I needed to get to know what was that. And so a PhD was in due course in the social sciences. It might surprise you and the viewers to know that I come from my undergrad is in visual communications, specifically graphic design. So this is a total new world for me to move from being the artist I was into the advocate, activist I am, and the academic I am in the space of countering Islamophobia and researching Islamophobia. So this is the context within which I emerged as a scholar in this space, due to anger and personal experiences of facing Islamophobia.
Maybe it's obvious that Islamophobia is racism and hatred of Muslims. Is that how you define it? Is there anything more sophisticated?
Yeah, the definition. When I first started researching Islamophobia into 2017 as a PhD student who was very new to Australia as a context and to the academic discipline of the social sciences, as well as specifically Islamophobia, my understanding of it was restricted to it as a form of anti-Muslim racism. But the more I read, the more I engaged, the more I became active within the spaces of Islam and Muslimness within a wide social political context named Australia, I've realized we can't stop there. Islamophobia cannot and is not only a social political phenomena within a multicultural Western white context. It's not. And my understanding of Islamophobia evolved rightfully so after the genocide in Gaza. I became aware of how deeply rooted this issue of Islamophobia is to geopolitical interest of an empire that is seeking to assert hegemony and domination over Middle Eastern countries, mostly Islamic countries, and how this project cannot be sustained without the ideology that gives it legitimacy, and this ideology is Islamophobia. So I moved away from understanding it as anti-Muslim racism within the social multicultural domains, which I first experienced it there and researched it there, into what it is really. It is an ideology that keeps the engine on of an empire that seeks to insert hegemony and domination onto resourceful in the Middle East. So this is how and where I understand Islamophobia. Closest definition of Islamophobia that I would take, especially after the genocide in Gaza, is Abdul Karim Vakil and Salman Sayed conception. Let's not call it a definition, because that's a very restrictive. It's a conception of Islamophobia where they call it the grammar of the world. And in that conception of Islamophobia, it draws a similarity between how linguistic grammar tells you the rules of what makes sense within linguistic. Similarly, with Islamophobia, the grammar of Islamophobia sheds some meanings and makes sense of phenomena within the world we live in. So, for example, if I say Muslim, because of the grammar of Islamophobia, people can easily and will easily associate Muslimness to terrorism or migrants or inferiority. So there has been, because of repetition and because of the long period of Islamophobia, the long period of war on terror, the 20 plus years of the war on terror, we have been living through that grammar, and so it has become part and parcel of how we define Muslimness. So I extended on Salman Sayed and Abdul Karim definition or conception, let's say, of Islamophobia as the grammar of the world, into trying to identify what are the main components of these grammars. So I could see, and looking into the Gaza genocide, so I could see that there's the grammar of civility, who is civilized and who is not civilized. The grammar of race, who belongs and who doesn't belong. The racialization of Muslims as barbaric or inferior. The grammar of visibility, who is visible, who is invisible, whose pain is visible and whose pain is invisible. And the last one is the grammar of security. Which violence is considered normal and accepted and legitimized, and which violence is considered terrorism. And so once you see the world through the grammar of Islamophobia, you can see how these four components of the rules around which violence is accepted, which life is worthful or valuable. This is how Islamophobia operates and in the spaces we live in.
So Islamophobia in that sense is both different from Orientalism, the way that European culture looked down on not just Muslims but people in the so-called East. It's different from it and it's much more recent. So can we pin it down as the starting point as the war on terror? Do you have a starting point that's useful?
Orientalism was the engine that kept colonization going on in the 18th century. Through Orientalism, colonizers in the 18th century legitimized the right of taking care of other people's land and resources and lives and matters through colonization, through direct boots on the ground engagement, which is called colonization. So that's Orientalism. Islamophobia is similar to Orientalism in the way by which it also legitimizes the new forms of colonialism that we're living through, which is empire building, the US empire building specifically. And this emerged specifically after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So if I can pin a time in which Islamophobia in this current shape and form that we're experiencing, which is the ideology of the empire, the ideology that sustains the heart and the logic of why we should, attack Iraq, why we should take over Afghanistan, why should we interfere in Libya, why we should support Israel. The logic that sustains this empire's actions and activities and dehumanization of Palestinians, of Muslims, is Islamophobia, is the ideology of Islamophobia. However, Islamophobia appeared in different shapes and forms throughout history. Like in the Crusades in the 7th century, Islamophobia was a religious phobia. It was based on religious, components. During the Ottoman Empire, for example, it was political phobia. They were scared of the expansion of an Islamic state into their borders. So it has different forms during different times. But if we're talking about Islamophobia in the sense that I've mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, as the ideology that sustains and gives life and logic and legitimizes the empire building practices of the US through Israel, then Islamophobia, I could pin it down into the Cold War and the 1960s, specifically when the US adopted Israel as this outcast democratic white state in the Middle East, where the US can, use this geopolitical space and entity to expand and to assure that its domination is continued.
All right, thank you. That's really useful. Now, we're going to move on to some more immediate and current questions. And look, some of what we're talking about is horrible, it's hurtful. We're talking about racism. So I just want to pause a moment to recognise that we are having this conversation literally minutes after Zoran Mamdani has been declared elected as the Mayor of New York, the first Muslim Mayor of New York, and a democratic socialist. And I think we can take this as a sign that we can fight back against the empire, we can fight back against the racism. And so I don't really want to talk about Zoran Mamdani because it's a different conversation. But I think I wanted to put that on the record first because it helps frame, I think, some of the discussion that follows. We shouldn't feel that it's one-way traffic from the Islamophobes, from the racists in our direction. Ordinary people can fight back, and he got more than 50% of the vote, so we can celebrate that. So moving on to my next question, a couple of months ago you wrote a piece for the website of Overland magazine entitled Where the Envoy's Islamophobia Report Fails Muslims, and I'll put a link to that article in the show notes. So what was wrong with the report from Aftab Malik? Can you take us through your arguments?
So my issue with the envoy is that the government, we all know that the government, we as, when I say we, I mean as a Muslim community, we know that the government is disgenuine about having or giving us a special treatment. And so the envoy, the creation of the envoy was an afterthought. The whole thing was, the government was intending to have a special dedicated Zionist anti-Semitic envoy because they were not very happy with the work that the Australian Human Rights Commission was doing, and not very happy specifically with Giri, who is the anti-racism commissioner. We know that. So they wanted to create a body that is separate from the anti-racism commission. But then they were like, oh, we're gonna get in trouble with the Muslim population. We have to appear as if we're, equalizing and leveling the field. Which leads to the second issue, a second problem with this whole thing. It has never been about, Muslims versus Jews thing. And they are insisting on making it appear as a religious issue. It's not a religious issue. There's a colonizer and colonized. This is exactly what's happening. It's a political issue. It's not a religious issue. But the government is so eager to try to paint it as such. So these are my two main problems with the creation of the envoy itself. The need to have the envoy itself. Now, the report that the Islamophobia envoy that which was issued, I wasn't surprised because the Aftab was handpicked, and there were other, Islamophobia scholars and experts who are actually genuinely experts, unlike Aftab, who were, dismissed and not even considered for the role. Not that they're going to accept the role, because we all know that it's a trick and that the entire role is disgenuine. So he's not an expert. He's done the consultations. The report misses the foundations on which it should have been based. A foundation of justice, a foundation of acknowledging the deep roots of Islamophobia as a geopolitical issue. The report just scratched the surface of Islamophobia as a problem of Australians who live in Australia and are getting discriminated against and harassed, which is the surface of the issue. And so if you are genuinely trying to issue a report that talks about Islamophobia in Australia at a time when there is a genocide ongoing in Gaza, and the entirety of your position as an Islamophobia envoy was created because of this conflict, how could you ever even not consider, connecting the dots back to anti-Palestinianism? It's starking omission. But the Islamophobia Register who could have done that and have been doing that. It's the Islamophobia Register have been issuing reports about Islamophobia in Australia in general. But if you have been, appointed at this specific time, within this specific context, you can't just dismiss the fact that the connection between anti-Palestinianism and Islamophobia, and how instances of increased Islamophobia in Australia is linked to the perception of Palestinianism as extension of Muslims and Islam.
For all its weaknesses, the report did make some recommendations which I think you acknowledged were useful. How come Albanese hasn't acted even on that kind of sort of very simple propositions that were put forward? Of course, I completely take your point that the last thing he wanted was anything that legitimised the case for Palestine. He's spent 2 years doing everything he can to defend Israel. But even if there was some straightforward, useful recommendations, there seems to be no action. How do you explain that?
Because Muslim life doesn't matter. Muslims' welfare doesn't matter. And this whole envoy thing was disgenuine. And you can even read it through the terms of reference. The terms of reference for these envoys, if you compare the terms of reference of the anti-Semitism envoy, and compare it to the terms of reference of the Islamophobia envoy, you can see the stark difference. And I wrote about it in my book. The Islamophobia envoy marked Muslims as a security risk. Within the anti-Semitism envoy, the terms of reference frames anti-Semitism as an existential crisis of Australianness. They use the sentence, the statement, threatening not only Jewish Australians but Australia as a whole. That's a statement in the terms of reference of the anti-Semitism envoy. Contrast this to the terms of reference on Islamophobia. It's reduced to harmful perceptions, positioning Muslims as outsiders, whose safety is only valuable insofar as it benefits social cohesion. The statement says, Muslim Australians, like all Australians, have the right to feel safe and secure, and their safety and security will, in turn, contribute to Australia's future as a peaceful, free, cohesive, and diverse multicultural society. So it places the well-being of Australian Muslims as a secondary factor that benefits the nation rather than an urgent priority in itself. While the anti-Semitism, envoy, terms of reference, frames anti-Semitism as an existential crisis, threatening not only Jewish Australians but Australia as a whole. So here's your answer.
Thank you. That's really clear. You mentioned before, and in your Overland article, you mention again about the false conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and how that feeds Islamophobia. How have you seen that debate unfold, in particular over the last 2 years?
I'm writing a paper about how Islamophobia enabled the Gaza genocide, and in my paper I have a whole section dedicated on how this new anti-Semitism that conflates genuine anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, this has become like an instrument, a mechanism of Islamophobia. And the way by which this happens is that first, Jews are considered part and parcel of the Western white civilization. And within the grammar of Islamophobia, who is the other? Who is the threat? Muslims. Within this new anti-Semitism framework that conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, Jews as an extension of a wide democratic Western civilization is being threatened by the Muslim terrorist, formation, which is in this case is embodied in the Palestinian movement. Any form of Palestinian support, the actual, existence of Palestinianism is perceived as a threat to the existence of the colonial entity that is Israel. So it creates a zero-sum game. Any support of Palestinian rights is treated as anti-Semitic. Solidarity, especially by Arabs and Muslims, is perceived as racist moral corruption. So this mechanism, which embeds Islamophobia into Western governance, justifies censorship, surveillance, and repression by portraying resistance to Israel's colonial violence or any support to Palestinians' existence as a civilizational betrayal of the West and its legitimate allies.
No, that's very clear. Thank you. I should just note as well, I happen to be Jewish, that many of us amongst anti-Zionist Jews who have been organising more and more over the last 2 years in particular would argue that the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism also fosters anti-Semitism, even at the same time as it fosters Islamophobia. Because if to be Jewish is to identify with Israel, and Israel is carrying out a genocide, then there is a reason to be hostile to Jews. One obviously I reject, and one I know that you reject as well. So the entire framework of the discussion is inherently reactionary and damaging. You mentioned just now social cohesion, and that's become a real buzz phrase. Here in Victoria, and we're both based in Victoria, the Allan Labor government is planning to make adherence to social cohesion a prerequisite for community groups to access public money. So what do they mean, our rulers? What do they mean by social cohesion? How should we understand it? And what kind of agenda is being concealed by that term?
One of the findings in my book that I talk about in my book is that social cohesion has been, for the past 20 plus years, a synonym of the counter-violent extremism strategy, which is a manifestation of Islamophobia. So both of them, the assumption that Muslims need somehow to integrate through state-led policies, focusing explicitly on Islam and Muslims in the West, that is a manifestation of Islamophobia, because it assumes that you do not belong and you need to belong for us to avoid the risk of you becoming a radical Muslim. So for 20 years, we have lived through that agenda of social cohesion as counter-violent extremism. The focus of social cohesion for that many years was on social and cultural conformity. What we're witnessing now, specifically after the genocide in Gaza and the government's use of rhetoric around social cohesion, the government is now using social cohesion as a silencing tool. It's a silencing tool to suppress any form of political dissent within the Muslim communities and anyone who supports Palestine by extension. If you speak up for Palestine, you're causing trouble, you're harming the social cohesion. If you're grieving because of Palestine, you're harming social cohesion. So social cohesion has become this new, it had always been there. Social cohesion has always been there. Now it has been repurposed as a silencing tool. Instead of pushing Muslims towards social and cultural conformity, it is a silencing tool, pushing Muslims to adopt a political position that is in line with the government and what the government wants, under this label of, we don't want to harm the cohesiveness of Australianness. So we're not allowed to mourn, we're not allowed to support Palestine, we're not allowed to grieve, we're not allowed to call out the atrocities, we're not allowed to challenge colonization, because all of these acts is considered damaging to the social cohesion of Australia.
I looked at the Allen government's proposed social cohesion pledge, and the wording is really milk and water. It's motherhood statements. At one level, it would be very hard to find anybody who couldn't agree with them. But in some ways, the very looseness of the language is a problem, because it will then be very easy to argue that this group or that group has broken the spirit of that wording. So it's a quite insidious threat to organisations that may well rely on a degree of public funding to provide services, and one that we should reject.
100%, and this is why I think the Islamophobia Envoy report and the position itself is performative, because you cannot do anti-Islamophobia work depending on the government's funding. It's incomprehensible. For you to be able to speak about Islamophobia, you have to be able to call out the government's connections to feeding Islamophobia and silencing Muslimness and weaponizing social cohesion as a tool to silence political dissent. And you can't do that when your funding and your job is being paid by the government. So, yeah, funding is a big issue here, where this is why many you would find within the Muslim community struggle to challenge Islamophobia, because they depend on the government's funding for that. And so with the social cohesion pledges and the social cohesion programs and agendas and money, and they're really pigeonholed.
Now, you've mentioned your book several times, and congratulations. It's a big effort. In terms of your motivation in writing, I'm going to quote some of your own words back at you. Academically, I was driven by the question, how do Australian Muslim community organisations understand and respond to Islamophobia? But on a more personal level, I was asking, how do we as Muslims sustain dignity and agency in a world that misrecognises us and our faith? Did you reach answers to your own questions?
Yes and no. I reached answers for my academic question on how they understand and respond to Islamophobia, but I still cannot find answers to how do we sustain dignity and agency when, especially if we're talking about Muslim organizations, if we're hooked to funding from the government, if we are part and parcel of working alongside the government. I feel that the only way for Muslim organizations, I'm talking about Muslim organizations now, the only way for Muslim organizations to gain agency and dignity is to be free from these strings attached to money and funding. Once they can detach themselves from a state that is abusive and Islamophobic, then they can do more work in the space of anti-Islamophobia and speak out about it in the comprehensive way we should talk about it, not only as, a hijabi Muslim being targeted on public transport. This is where the government wants us to focus. This is where they want to pin the problem as just an issue that is far away from policies and their engagement as a state in Muslim affairs, domestically and internationally.
As I understand it, because I haven't had a chance to read the book because it hasn't come out yet, but as I understand it, you've talked about two phases in a sense of Islamophobia. So in the first phase from 2014 to 2018, you're talking about how Muslim community organisations respond in a period marked by the rise of ISIS, a surge in anti-Muslim political rhetoric, and culminating in the Christchurch terrorist attack, and we should remind people it was an Australian terrorist, on praying Muslims in New Zealand, Aotearoa. So what conclusions did you draw around that period?
So the entirety of my book tries to grasp or document and record how Australian Muslim organizations understood Islamophobia during that phase, which is an extension of the war on terror, and how they responded to it. And what I found is that they do understand Islamophobia as far more than the isolated incidents of racism. They do understand that it has systematic institutional roots within the state, and it is deeply connected to Australia's colonial history and white privilege. Now, although they do understand it, beyond just the anti-racism social manifestation of it, take a more pragmatic response to it, where it is still confined within the state-led social cohesion and belonging frameworks that I've problematized in my previous answer. And they still focus on extending, solutions either towards enhancing Muslimness through, empowerment, enhancing religiosity, upskilling Muslims' behaviors. And the other side is building bridges where they engage in interfaith dialogue and cross-cultural engagements and all that. Their advocacy, political advocacy especially, around that time was close to non-existent, with the exceptions of peak bodies only, which did call out the government a couple of times for some Islamophobic narratives and rhetoric. But other than that, there was nothing in the space of political advocacy. My research and my book tries to understand what was the logic of action? Why were they doing what they were doing? So in one way, they were aiming to assert their Muslimness and their Australianness through their actions and activities. In another way, they were trying to be apologetic about the misbehaviors that some Muslims may do within within Australian contexts. So although Australian Muslim organizations, I found they understand Islamophobia as deeper than just anti-Muslim racism, they're still pragmatic about how they go about in responding to it. And without going into the details of my analysis and all the details on how they do it and how they respond, I could summarize the main strategy that they deploy into what I call Muslim positive hypervisibility. So through a Muslim positive hypervisibility, what they aim to do is to put Muslimness or Muslims out there more as positive citizens, basically. So, and which means that they want to engage further in interfaith dialogues, in cross-cultural engagements, appear on the media far more than they do at the moment, at that time, I mean. And so Muslim positive hypervisibility is their main strategy.
Okay. And how was that? Because this is something you also cover in your book, that strategy was shaken up by the way that Australia responded to the events in Gaza after October the 7th, the way the Australian government responded to the genocide. In fact, the very fact that they won't call it a genocide and have continued to support Israel politically, militarily, culturally, and so on. And you say that shook up that previous paradigm, and I'm quoting you, catalysed new forms of activism that depart from the pre-Christchurch context. So what are those forms of activism, and what can we look forward to in the future? Not just what's happened in the last couple of years, but how has that changed things for 2026 and onwards?
So my conversations with founders and leaders within some Muslim community organizations after the genocide in Gaza exposed that they have realized that any form of Muslim positive hypervisibility within this performative multicultural context was not enough to grant Muslims the same level of recognition as Australians, let alone as equal human beings deserving of life. They seem to have moved away from decades-long conversations engaged with the state and Zionist faith-based organizations. They have deployed, for example, in 2024 during Ramadan, they have boycotted the state-led Ramadan iftars, which is a phenomenal act of dissonance. And they have walked away from interfaith dialogue and networks that was formed within the domain of, within the agenda of social cohesion that has dominated the spaces of Muslim engagement with wider Australian community. They have realized that the only form of effective anti-Islamophobia engagement would have to be on basis of justice, because predominantly Islamophobia is an issue of injustice, and it is not a social issue, it's a geopolitical issue. It's not an Australian problem, it's an international, transnational problem, and it's not socially engineered, it is geopolitically manufactured. So, and they've realized, I guess, and I hope, that Islamophobia is not about the misrecognition of their Australianness as citizens, which my book have discovered, but it's the devaluation of their life as human beings, which we've witnessed in Gaza. And without this dehumanization and the lack of empathy towards Muslims' life, you can't fight Islamophobia.
And do you think that has flowed through to a greater willingness to take to the streets for Palestine? We've seen obviously some very big demonstrations over the last 2 years. The biggest one in Sydney over the Harbour Bridge, but here in Narm, in Melbourne, we've seen rallies up, by my estimate, of up to 45,000, with large numbers of people from the Muslim community. Is that, in your mind, a big shift? And do you think people won't go back to the old ways?
I genuinely hope that people will not go back to the old ways. Without a proper understanding of how this genocide was enabled, Muslims and anyone will keep on falling back into the trap of scratching the surface level of what their discrimination or what their experiences of Islamophobia or racism is. They have to understand how their issues here in the West, in Australia, is interlinked and connected to the issues of Muslims abroad. We can't pretend that Islamophobia is a Western multicultural issue.
What is your final message to listeners based on your research and on your book?
My message to the listeners is that please stop talking about Islamophobia as a anti-Muslim racism social issue. It's a political ideology that has been manufactured by Zionist entities from the 1960s onward, and it have enabled the genocide in Gaza, And so your experiences of Islamophobia in the West is linked to how and why Zionist entities and Israel treats Palestinians in Palestine. They are connected, and you cannot solve your everyday issues of Islamophobia and dream of a better life without calling out the deep roots of why you're facing Islamophobia in the West.
Okay, thank you. That's a very clear message, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, David, for the opportunity. Thank you.